specific training will be indicated in there. A lot of times with your delegation of authority log, you will also have them use their initials. Sometimes it's hard to read someone's quickly scribbled initials. We all know how easy it is to read some of our physicians' handwriting sometimes. So you want to make sure that they have been properly trained. That's why we can't always just ask whoever's standing by, oh, can you do this for me? They have to make sure that they have been properly trained. Someone is going on vacation. You want to make sure that whoever is taking over for you has received the proper training, is on that delegation of authority log before they touch your study records. And so that means attributable, whether it be the PI, whether it be a coordinator. You just have to make sure that it's recorded somewhere. So other logs where you might be putting down who is working on the study is your delegation of responsibility, delegation of authority. They tend to be used interchangeably. Your training logs, you'll see that information on adverse event logs, severe adverse event logs, medication logs, and then if you're doing a log of the various consent versions, you want to make sure that you're documenting who is making those corrections, who is adding things to the log. If you've gone in and you've added a medication, you want to put your initials there, that you were the one that added it and what you were basing that on. So again, making sure that it's attributable. So next we have L for legibility. Definition, ability of being read or deciphered, especially with ease, easily readable. So this is an issue when you are writing in your documents, especially if a physician, and I know that this is kind of a common joke, but in my experience, physicians do have handwriting that is sometimes very difficult to read. So you want to make sure that whatever is written is legible. I went through an FDA audit probably about 5 years ago, in which case we had a nurse that was known for her handwriting being difficult to read. The only finding that the FDA auditor really found for that particular study was her handwriting, that it was very difficult to read what she was writing in her recordings of patient outcomes. The FDA auditor suggested that in the future that she could write in the study folder at the time, but that afterwards perhaps it would be good if she were to type it out and then sign it and date it, stating that she had transcribed it for herself so that it would be readable for someone that might not be able to decipher what she had written. It was noted in the study log that if they couldn't read it, to please see the typed note as to what was written. So again, this was something that an FDA auditor had instructed us to do. So there again, after your subject has left, always go back and really read what was written in the chart, making sure that it's understandable, that if something needs to be added to be clarified, that you do it at that time. Your memory is best at that time, but make sure that if someone else were to open that folder, be it handwritten or typed in, that it's understandable so that you can clear up any misunderstandings at that time. And there are some ways that you can help make things easier to record on your source documents, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on with quality by design. And that's what the QBD stands for, is quality by design, which I believe one of the revisions coming out in next year is talking about use of quality by design before you even start a study. We'll talk about that later. So C is for contemporaneous, occurring in the same period of time. So what information was recorded at the time of the event? This speaks to the ability that when the event is occurring or when you have been told the information, that you write it down at that point. As we all know, memory is a little distortion involved there. Sometimes if there's been an event, some type of crime, officers will come and they will ask all of those that may have witnessed something, and they'll always get all sorts of different responses. It was a tall person, it was a short person. Well, that kind of depends on what their height is. Everybody is tall in my world, since I never made 5 foot. So everybody's going to be tall. Whereas if it's someone who's 6'2", they're all going to be small. So again, recording what is happening at the time that it is happening makes it more accurate. And you want to make sure that you're copying that information, recording that information at the time that it occurred. If you are recording it at a time different than the time that it occurred, in other words, it was an adverse event that occurred right there, no, you're not going to be able to record it at that point in time. But when you do record it, make sure that you're stating that this happened yesterday or the day before or on such and such a date. You're making sure that you're recording when that particular event occurred so that they don't think that it happened on the same date and time. Often at a study visit, there are things that are supposed to occur, such as I've dealt a lot with pediatric studies, the parent telling you, yeah, they were placed on this medication. And then you ask them further questions of what was the dosage, how often were they supposed to take it, and they're unsure. So they say, but they'll call you back. Okay, that's fine. But then when they call you back and when you record it in the log, instead of recording it in such a way that it appears as if you obtained it on the day of the study visit, make sure that you're adding it as parent called in 2 days later with this information and add it in. We used to have that issue when doing inclusion, exclusion, and getting study labs. The lab was drawn and taken, but those results were not back to put on the inclusion, exclusion source doc until a couple days later. Yes, you go in and you put that value in, but then you initial and date it the day that you put it in. So it doesn't look as if you received that result the same day. So again, you want to make sure that you're recording it and also including the date and time, not necessarily always the time, but the date that it actually occurred, so that there is a good flow of the timing of the occurrences. Again, it's going to be fresh in your mind if you do it right away, and so you want to make sure that it's there. A lot like doing citations when doing research papers. In today's world, we use a lot of things downloaded from the internet. You Google everything. So when you're taking that in your citation, you are also supposed to include the date that you downloaded it. So that this goes in with contemporaneous with your citations, as when did you get it. So O is for original. This comes back a lot to a lot of our electronic records. So the definition is arising or proceeding independently of anything else. The physician who writes the patient note on a napkin. That napkin is your original source doc. Could be a Post-it. I worked with a study, and I had a study nurse that when she was taking the vitals, she would take a Post-it and write the vitals on the Post-it. She was taking the patient from a scale over to a different place for the blood pressure, so she would write everything on a Post-it. That Post-it was actually the source doc. That was the original source of the information, was her writing it on that Post-it. So I would often just tape that Post-it to the source doc. I would put the information in the correct fields on the source doc. That helps you when you're doing data entry, but the original Post-it was also included. Electronic records are tricky. A lot of times if you're printing out your source docs or the original records from your electronic record, the page that is printed has coding at the bottom of the date and who the user was that printed it out. The user may be in the form of a numerical code, but it is dated. Some sponsors want that to be certified in the sense that you then go through and sign and date each and every page. Again, that's something that the sponsors ask for. The regulations don't specify as to how that is going to occur. A lot of companies will allow you to just print out the records if you're making a hard copy chart. But again, these are things that prior to starting a visit or prior to starting a study, talk to your sponsor. If there is a sponsor, make those decisions ahead of time. These are things that you can write down, that this is how we're going to handle recording or reporting original source documents. This is how it's going to be handled. Make that a note to file, that you've file it in your regulatory binder, so that it's clear from the very beginning as to how these things are going to be handled. So again, O is for original. Makes it difficult with some of the new things that are coming out, which is why they're making some of these revisions. We're using a lot of technology now where we are recording the patient's responses straight into an iPad or things like that. So having that original document is difficult to include in a study. So you have to find workarounds for making sure that you have the original source recorded before any alterations have been made to it. So again, it can be a little fuzzy during these times, but always try to get the document where it was originally written down before any changes could be made. Accurate. Definition: free from error, careful or meticulous, consistent with a standard. And again, this kind of goes back to, once documented, has the information been reviewed? So often we're forced to do things faster and faster and faster. So sometimes it's best to go back, reread what has been written or typed or recorded, and make sure that it is accurate, that there isn't something that has been left out. If you have a team of multi-individuals, sometimes ask someone else to maybe look at it. Is this your memory of the events? Especially when there's been some type of error or there was some type of confusion during a visit, make sure that you get a complete picture of what was happening. This always helps later on if there are audits or you're monitored, of being able to remember what happened, when it happened, and things like that. Complete. This was actually added at a later date, probably because we have multi-site studies that are much more complex. Definition is having all parts, lacking nothing, being whole. And this is where you want to make sure that all of your I's have been dotted, all of your T's have been crossed. And this also falls into some of your source document, your CRFs, in that you want to make sure nothing is forgotten. Again, this is something that you can kind of add in with your quality by design, how you design your CRFs. One of the things that we found in some of our studies is that the sponsor would specify that once the patient arrived, we were to wait 15 minutes before we took their blood pressure so that we would get a resting blood pressure. What we did was in the actual CRF, we would say, did you wait the 15 minutes? There was a study in which this was particularly important, that when that blood pressure was taken. So we would put that in the CRF of saying, you know, did you wait 15 minutes? And we would say yes, or we would even put down the time that the patient arrived and the time that the blood pressure was taken so that we could demonstrate that yes, it was in that 15 minutes. Now, when we went to the electronic data capture, the EDC, we would just put in the blood pressure, but we had it documented if there was ever a question. That was how we made it complete so that we could answer that question should it arise. And this is where the most recent revision, the E6 in 2.1, they spoke about that it should be complete. Everything should be there. That also goes to if you're closing up a study and there was material that you used for teaching, for marketing, you want all of that information included in your closeout box, or however you bring it all together. Again, why are these so? It's the validation of the results. We have had studies that were closed 10 years be recalled in order to look at questions that have been newly raised. Did this happen? And at the time, we didn't think anything of it. We recorded it, thankfully, but 10 years after the fact, there was a question as to how something occurred. One of those was the way that patients were randomized into a trial. We were running at the very edge of the time constraints, and the child was not feeling well that day. Now, technically, we could have forced the child to go through those things, but it was the sponsor's decision not to do a particular test on that day, but to bring them back, but to go ahead and randomize them because they met all the criteria. 10 years later, there was a question as to why the child was randomized in that fashion. And if you were to ask me at the time, I'm like, you're asking me to remember something that occurred 10 years ago when I have a hard time with last week. Fortunately, we had documented it well in the study chart and in the study binder as to what had occurred and why it had occurred, and that the decision was in the best interest of the child, who was not sick that day but was feeling poorly. So it was our saving grace on that one, was the notes. The other thing that you need to consider documenting is the monitoring plan. This was something that was added in the revision, that every study should have a monitoring plan in place prior to you getting started. This kind of goes back to making sure that you're in agreement with how you're going to include your electronic medical records. What is that sponsor interested in? How do they want this recorded? But this also is helpful for planning out your job if you know that they're going to be coming every month as opposed to coming every 6 months. We started a study at one time that was looking at massive amount of data that was accrued during an ICU visit. This was for traumatic brain injury. And they decided 6 months into the study that the monitoring plan would be remote and that they wanted us to upload all this information into specified box on the web, like we have our box for placing documents in a specific manner with specific printed out electronic medical records that were highlighted so that they could see where it came from. When you're talking 7 days of ICU data where blood pressures are recorded every 15 minutes, that's a lot of information. The study had almost 700 data points in it. So it went from a one-person study that we had planned out that one person could record this amount of data because the patients only were maybe 1 or 2 a month, whereas putting all that extra work on as far as monitoring, we needed to add additional FTEs to the study in order to comply with that monitoring plan. That's why you want the monitoring plan specified prior to starting a study so that you can make sure that you can meet those training needs, how it's going to be done. And this is also for the good of the study site as well as the sponsor. Have that agreement beforehand. How are we going to do that? If it's risk-based, what are those risk factors that they are most concerned about? These are all things that you want to make sure you have up front. So again, make sure that you're putting monitoring plans in place. Even if it's not real technical, they're going to come once a year because it's a very low-risk study, then that's what it is. But for some of these more complex studies, it's almost like you have to give that monitor a desk in the office because they're going to be there all the time because it's such a high-risk study. So you want to make sure that you have planned accordingly. So make sure you have that monitoring plan in place prior to really getting the study started. Ask those questions ahead of time. Again, quality by design. So I made a reference to a note to file, and you want to be careful how you document notes to file because a note to file is not always the answer. If a monitor comes in and you have a lot of notes to file, they're going to start questioning why are there so many errors. And a note to file is not necessarily an error as it is a clarification of why something happened in the way that it did. So for instance, for my study where we randomized the child a little bit differently as into the timing of the procedures for the benefit of the child, because we had put a note to file in, that is what saved us. Now, the note to file did not need to go into the regulatory binder. I was a new enough coordinator at that time, I just documented it everywhere because I wasn't sure. But the proper place for it to have been recorded would have been in the patient's chart. This was something that occurred and it only affected that one patient. Now, if it was a change in the way that we were going to perform certain things and that was going to affect the entire study, then that note to file would have been placed in the regulatory document as well. This is important because these notes to file to the regulatory binder are really about administrative, technical changes to the entire study. A lot of times people are using it because they didn't know where to document things. So a note to file is supposed to include when something happened, why, and what the outcome was. A CAPA, a corrective action plan. These are things that go in your regulatory binder. Yes, the event occurred usually to one patient, but this is how you're going to change things. A study that has two different versions of a consent. We ended color coding because it was too easy to confuse them. So one was blue and one was yellow. That was what we used in order to keep it straight. That was documented by a note to file in the regulatory binder because it was going to affect how we did the entire study. Had nothing to do with ethics or anything like that. It was just a workaround to make sure we kept things straight. They're generally created when there's an absence of some type of documentation concerning the study. If it is something that occurred just to a patient, it needs to be documented in their chart. If it is something that happened to a patient and it's documented in their chart, but it's going to affect how all patients are going to be handled subsequent to that, then you want to also make sure that it's in your regulatory binder. Which also brings us to the regulatory binder, essential documents. You've probably heard these referred to. So this is that, well, it used to be the big old thick book. Nowadays they're going more electronic, but it was the binder or the place where all of your important documents, your different versions of the consent. It could be monitoring reports. It could be contracts, anything administrative that had to do with the study. And you could teach an entire session on essential documents and what needs to be in there. But again, with notes to file, sometimes now the way that you handle those massive amounts of documents, you keep them in an electronic form, but if you go to the hard binder, they're not kept there. So you can use a note to file saying, for instance, your CVs. All of the CVs are kept in this location. All of the licenses are kept in this location. Giving them instructions such as a map of, you're not going to find it here, it's over here, and it's kept there and maintained. Used to be that you had one CV, you had a PI, you might have a nurse. That was it. Now we have multi-sites, multi-PIs, all sorts of combinations. So sometimes it is easier to keep all of that information in one central location for all the various studies. Temperature logs. You have a -80 freezer where specimens are kept. And so you keep a running log, and it may be that you take measurements so many times, once a week or once a day, or you have electronic information that is logging it continually. There again, a lot of information. You can put in there temperatures are monitored via such and such a system, and that if you need to check for that, here's where you would find it. Sometimes they'll want, if there was an excursion, they'll want hard documentation that they can add to their their files showing that how far it went and things like that. So with all of the stuff that is electronic, there's also what they call a shadow chart. This is where information that is filed electronically is also kept in a hard copy form. When I worked at Children's, we had the phrase, if you were hit by a bus concept, of always making sure that you left your desk in such a way, or that you planned your study visits in such a way that if you were hit by a bus on your way to work one day, that someone else could pick up and carry forward while you were unexpectedly out of the office. So shadow charts can be helpful for that. We would do it when we would, as a clinical research service, just do certain parts of a study, so that we would keep some pertinent information, like we would keep a copy of the consent showing that we did have the right to take that subject's blood, their blood samples and things like that, even though the primary office was the one running the study. But we would keep it on our floor just so, for patient safety more than anything. So, which also brings me to the use of quality by design for your CRFs. It's not really source documentation, it's your CRF, wherever you're going to record it. Making sure that when you design those CRFs that you are putting all of the information in that you're going to need, and also adding those little snippets of information of reminders. Where you record the information on that CRF or the source doc is you can put anything on that source doc because it's not going to necessarily be entered into an EDC. So what we did with the blood pressure, we had a place that said what time did the patient arrive, what time was the first blood pressure taken. They wanted us to, another study, take 3 measurements and then take the average of the 3. So we would have a place on there where you would record 1, record 2, record 3, and then we'd actually put in the equation to calculate what that average was. Again, sometimes in the heat of the moment, your brain just freezes and you know how to take an average, but it's just not coming. So that's why we put the equation in. Others where you calculate dosage or something, we'll put the equation in. That way we have predetermined that if there is one of those brain freezes, that it's still carried out, that we don't forget to make the patient sit for 15 minutes before we do their blood pressure, or that we don't forget to add an additional something to the study. It helps us kind of remember what the steps are as far as making sure that everything is done. When you have one of those visits where a patient comes in and they're here for 2 or 3 hours because they're undergoing all these different assessments, somewhere 10 different assessments, or that there's surveys that they need to take, and you're trying to get that in between the different providers coming in and doing what they need to do, having a checklist as part of your source docs really does help as far as making sure that everything was done, that they got their blood draw, that they did their 6-minute walk test, that they took this survey and that survey and the depression survey, and as you know, the list can go on. Have that checklist for each visit so that you know exactly what it is you're supposed to be doing. Also, make sure that you have something at your visits about your safety labs. So often with your studies, and this was especially true for the pediatric population, there might be 10 different labs that they would want done. Well, unfortunately, while it might require a larger amount of blood than we were able to get out of a small patient, so sometimes we would have to make that decision. It wanted 10 mLs of blood, and we were only able to get 5. So what labs need to be done first in order to ensure the safety of the subject, but also which ones were key to your study endpoints. A lot of times you have, as I often call it, the Men in Black syndrome, where Will Smith, if you have ever seen the movie, and he's getting to choose what weapons to go after the aliens with, and he says one of those, one of those, one of those, one of those. Well, sometimes the PIs have that tendency that, oh, well, we've got the subject in the office and we're taking their blood. Well, why don't we get this, and we could get this, and we could get this and this, and you have to say time out. There's only so much blood and only so much that we can ask our subjects to go through. So there again, plan those things ahead of time, because Murphy's Law, it will happen if you don't. If you plan for it, it won't happen. But if you don't plan for it, it most assuredly probably will. Making sure that on your inclusion exclusion form, this is probably one of the key areas of using quality by design. Make sure that you indicate what is inclusion as far as a value. So pediatrics, that they have a normal blood pressure within normal limits. That is going to vary based on the age of the child. What is a normal blood pressure for a 2-year-old is going to be different than a normal blood pressure for a 16-year-old. Therefore, put it into the document. That we used a chart for the one study I worked on for that, but put in there what that norm is. If it's a lab value that it needs to be considered normal, put what that normal range is. So it makes it very easy at the time that you record that data to know, is it inclusion or are they out? That will prevent you from doing things that do not need to be done. If you go in and they have an abnormal that is not inclusive, then you stop. You don't have to do any other screening events if they've already failed one. Therefore, that's why you always want to do your screening events in order of least to most invasive. Excuse me. So that the easier ones are done, or at least one of the major ones. Do they have the disease and how is it documented? Might be one, but rather than waiting until they have to have a biopsy, wait until they've passed those other inclusion criteria first. Always want to ask, are there questions? I'm so used to that. So your electronic health record. Again, this is one that make sure that you have talk to your sponsors how they want that handled as far as documenting in the patient record. Also make sure that you have your subject's permission and that you have that on file, that they have given you permission to look at their medical charts. And also you want that signed as to who talked to them and things like that. Just remember that when sharing the electronic medical record with the sponsors, certain information needs to be de-identified as far as HIPAA when sharing those documents. They know the patient as a number. Now, again, there's some variability in this because of risk factors in the studies. So these are things that you want to make sure are clearly defined prior to starting a study. They need to see it as kind of like a blinding. They just need to know that the subject fits the criteria. Now, a monitor that comes on site is going to see the patient's name, but that information which is sent to the sponsor, copied to the sponsor, needs to be de-identified. So make sure you understand what that is and that you're following the proper directions on that. So the other thing is, you may have heard about Part 11 compliance, and this was something that was outlined in the revision for ICH E6, was because we do use more electronic records now than in 1996 when it was first came out. Make sure that you can demonstrate the tenets of ALCOA C. So make sure your system is what they call PAR 11. And so everybody always says, well, what does that mean? It means that if you go into an electronic data capturing system, an EDC, that if you make a change, that in the background, there is something that is logging that on such and such a date, the initials of KC made a correction to this data point from 10 to 12. And as you know, on a lot of queries, if you're making that change, you also have to specify why. So in other words, if you had 12 written down and you change it to 21, that was just an error. You transposed the digits, or that you recorded it in the wrong place, whatever. An electronic data set that is Part 11 compliant means that behind the scenes, it is recording what those changes were when they occurred. So that's what they talk about. REDCap, which is one of our bigger data capture systems here at the university sometimes, is one that is capable of being Part 11 compliant. Doesn't mean that it is all the time, but it has the capacity. And what it takes is, as part of being Part 11 compliant, it means that your IT people must run certain testing protocols on that software ever so often. In other words, it has to be set up in the background. So if you have a data capture system, always ask, is this Part 11 compliant? Now, there are some out there that's what they'll talk about, but if you're creating a grow your own database, this is something that you want to talk to your IT people about as to how you're going to make it Part 11 compliant if you plan on taking it to the FDA. So again, there's some of those things that you might not need it to be that compliant, but if this is a drug that you're going to be asking for approval from the FDA, it needs to be Part 11 compliant. So that's pretty much what I have for today. Here are some references of some places that I went and got some information. If there are any questions in the chat, Rachel Bergman, who is assisting me so graciously, if we have anything in chat. If not, I wanted to bring up one last thing. One of the things that we will be talking about as we move forward are the JTF Competencies, the Joint Task Force. So this is something that is being moved out for the profession of clinical research professionals, but there are a series of 8 areas that we need to be able to show that we're proficient in. I'll explain it more if you don't know about JTF, but today's topics were that fulfill these particular JTF competencies if you are one who is tracking your own growth as far as a clinical research professional. And I'll have more about that in December when we talk about the profession of clinical research professionals. So again, today we'll be sending out the copies of the slides to everybody. I was going to check to see if there was any chat.
There was one question, Karen.
Okay.
Someone asked, what is Section 11?
Okay, so Section 11, if they're talking Part 11, that's usually in reference to the EDC, there can be Part 11. So within the Code of Federal Regulations, there is the Code of Federal 21 CFR, and then sometimes they can have different parts of that where they break it down into the legalese. So Section 11 is that by itself is not really giving me enough information to really say what Section 11 is. There's various sections that it could be in regards to. So if you want to send me an email directly, I'll answer that. Which reminds me, anytime you have a question or you need a clarification for something, please reach out to me. My email is very easy at the medical center. It's Karen K. The K is my middle initial, and the last name is Carter. So it's Karen K. Carter at osumcmedicalcenter.edu. I am always open to answering questions. If I don't have the answer, I can find you an answer. If you're looking for a source and I don't know about it, I will find it for you. These are things that are very important to me. If you're finding a training need that is not being met, please let me know. We will be working with a workforce development group within the next month or so to try to outline trainings for 2021. So if there is a topic that is of primary interest to you or that you could really use more information on, please let me know. And that is not strictly confined to clinical research or human subject trials. That could be any of the soft skills that you would like to see more on, such as hard conversations or how to build your profession and things like that. So actually, probably in November, there will be a REDCap survey that I'll be sending to all of you with some of those questions in it, of asking specifically, would you be interested in a training such as this? Because we're really trying to be creative with what we have to offer. Excuse me, allergies, but really be thinking of what would help you in your job to do your job better. And that is what I'm here for. So again, today's slides will be forthcoming. Certificates will be forthcoming. It may be Monday before we get some of those done because I need to teach Rachel how to do what I used to do, thankfully, Rachel. And so I need to find the time to do that. But if you have further questions of today or need some direction, please just contact me. Next month's training series will again be postponed due to the Office of Responsible Research Protection having an FDA seminar. I believe this one is going to be on devices. That will be on the second Thursday at 9. So in order for people to attend that, because I know that there is more coming out with the devices, that we're just moving our training series 2 weeks later so that people can attend both. And I wish everybody a good rest of this month. Not much left to it. Please be safe, wear your mask, and stay 6 feet away from everybody. So with that, thank you and have a good day.